The next system we're going to look at is the circulatory system. So, this is part one of our lessons on the circulatory system. So, a circulatory system has three main functions. So, the first is to transport things around the body. So, the circulatory system transports gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide. It transports nutrients, waste, hormones all around the body. The other thing it does is that it regulates internal temperature, and it also protects against blood loss from injury and against disease causing or toxic substances introduced into the body. There are two types of circulatory systems. There are open circulatory systems, and in these type of systems, blood flows freely within the body cavity and makes direct contact with the organs and tissues. So it's not kept completely separate. And this is mainly found in invertebrates. And closed circulatory systems, which is what we have, is the blood is contained within vessels and it's kept separate from other body tissues. And this is mainly found in vertebrates. So this diagram shows you the difference, right? So with the open system, you can see the blood comes from the heart, and then when it reaches sort of the end of the vessel, it just goes out into the body. Whereas in a closed circulatory system, the blood is always maintained within vessels. So a circulatory system has three main elements. The first are some type of transport vessels, a transport medium, and a pumping mechanism. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the first two of those, the vessels and the transport medium, which is the blood. And then in part two, we'll look at the pumping mechanism. And so that's the heart. So starting with the transport vessels, the mammalian circulatory system contains three main types of blood vessels. There are the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. So this diagram shows the arteries, which are often shown in red, and they're carrying blood coming from the heart, then goes into capillaries, and then back to veins and returns to the heart. So we look at each one a little more closely. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, and that's what defines them as an artery. So you can remember that they both start with A. Arteries take blood away from the heart. And a small artery is called an arteriole. All the arteries, except for one, carry oxygenated blood, which is why they're normally shown as red, because the blood is oxygenated. The one artery that goes from the heart to the lungs, which is the pulmonary artery, carries deoxygenated blood. So it's the exception. So the key thing here is the arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, and they are mostly carrying oxygenated blood, but there is one that does not. Then if we look at veins, so the definition of a vein is a vessel that carries blood toward the heart or back to the heart from the rest of the body. A small vein is called a venule. And similar to arteries, there's one exception, but all veins, except that one exception, carry deoxygenated blood. So the blood has gone out to the body, the oxygen's been used up. So now, as the blood comes back to the heart, it is deoxygenated. The vein that comes from the lungs to the heart is carrying oxygenated blood, and that's the pulmonary vein. And when we talk about the heart, we'll look at that a little more closely and look at how the blood goes through the heart and through the lungs to pick up that really important oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. And then the last type were the capillaries, which are networks of really tiny blood vessels, and they're located throughout the whole body. And this is where the gases and the nutrients are exchanged from the blood into the tissue cells that need them. So if we kind of start the blood at the heart, it travels from the heart through arteries, then it's going to branch out into arterioles, then into capillaries, and then as it comes out the capillaries, it's now heading back to the heart, so it goes through venules and finally into veins back to the heart. So this is kind of a schematic drawing of the human circulatory system. And so we're going to talk about the main arteries and veins that make up this system. So the first one is the aorta. So the aorta is the main artery coming out of the heart. Okay, so we're going to start going through the arteries. So the aorta comes out of the heart. If the blood is headed to the upper part of the body, it's going to get into the carotid artery, which takes the blood into the neck and the head. If it's going down the body, essentially, places it can go so it can branch off into the mesenteric artery, which is taking blood to the digestive tract. There's a hepatic artery, which is not shown in this diagram, but it does exist. It's taking the blood into the liver. Then we have the renal artery, which is taking the blood into the kidneys. And finally, the iliac artery, which is taking the blood into the lower part of the body, so into your legs. Okay, the last artery that we have to mention, which is on the other side of the diagram, because it's got deoxygenated blood, but is still an artery because the blood has left the heart. So that's the pulmonary artery, which is taking blood from the heart to the lungs. So now if we look at the veins side of it, kind of do this in reverse. So as the blood comes out of the lower part of the body, it's going to go into the iliac vein, heading back towards the heart. Blood coming out of the kidneys comes out in the renal vein. There's a special vein called the hepatic portal vein, which brings blood from the digestive tract to the liver. So one of the liver's functions is getting rid of toxins, right? So after the blood has gone through the digestive tract, it may have picked up something from the food you've eaten. So it needs to go through the liver first before it heads back to the heart to potentially be detoxified. So that's the role of the hepatic portal vein. And then the hepatic vein takes the blood out of the liver. So all those veins would then join into the inferior vena cava, which is from the, that should say, lower body back to the heart. And then for the top part of the body, the jugular vein takes the blood from the head and the neck, joins into the superior vena cava, which that one's correct, from the upper body back to the heart. Okay, so those are the main ones. Oh, we've forgotten one, the pulmonary vein, right? So on the other side of the diagram, we have to have the blood coming from the lungs to the heart. It is oxygenated, unlike the rest of the veins. So that's the pulmonary vein on the other side. Okay, so those are the main arteries and veins in the human circulatory system. There are lots and lots of others, but we're not going to talk about those. So how does the body keep the blood moving? So we know that the blood is pumped from the heart. But as the blood vessels get smaller and smaller as it goes throughout the body, there's a lot of friction happening and the blood starts to move really slowly. And the heart alone cannot exert enough pressure to drive the blood around the entire circulatory system. So each type of vessel has special adaptations that help keep the blood flowing. So first we'll talk about the arteries and how they're structured to help keep the blood flowing. So arterial walls are going to be thick and muscular because they're going to have high pressure. Remember that arteries are taking blood out of the heart. right? So as the heart contracts and pumps the blood out, there's a really high pressure. So the arteries need to be really thick and muscular so that they don't burst under that high pressure. So their outer wall is made of really tough, inelastic fibers so that the vessel doesn't bulge and doesn't leak. The middle layer, which is the largest layer, is made up of elastic fibers and smooth muscle to help pump the blood after each heartbeat. So the arteries actually do some pumping also. So the heart pumps, and then the arteries are also pumping the blood to get it out into the rest of the body. The inner layer of the artery is only a single cell thick, and it's really smooth cells so that there's reduction in friction as the blood courses through the vessel. Arteries are smaller, so they have a narrow lumen. So the lumen's just the middle space. And so it's small to keep the pressure up and help the blood move to where it's needed. And so now if we look at the structure of veins, you'll see that it's kind of the opposite almost. So vein walls are thinner because they're not helping pump the blood, and there's low pressure. So there's little danger of bursting, right? The blood is now trying to make its way back to the heart. It hasn't been pumped as much, right? So there's low pressure. It has a large lumen, so a big space in the middle, so that there's not very much resistance to the slower moving blood. The blood has more space to move through. Veins also have one-way valves that make sure the blood moves toward the heart and doesn't flow in the wrong direction. So veins don't pump. So you might be wondering, well, how does the blood get back? And so it gets back by the action of muscles outside the circulatory system. So all the other stuff that's working in your body, your different organs, when you're walking, when you're talking, any movement that your body is doing, well, that's helping the blood move through your veins. So now if we look at capillaries, so capillaries are quite simple in comparison. So they just are made up of a single layer of flattened cells so that there's a short distance for the nutrients and the gases to diffuse between the blood and the tissues. And they have a very narrow lumen so that they can fit into small spaces. So there's just a single layer of cells in the wall with a very narrow lumen. So this diagram shows the three different types of vessels, right? So you can compare the artery has the thicker wall to help with the pumping, make sure it doesn't burst. The vein has the thinner wall. The artery has the smaller lumen to keep the pressure high, whereas the vein has the larger lumen to reduce resistance to flow. The veins have these valves that keep the blood moving in the right direction. And then the capillaries are just made of a single layer of cells along the outside. So those are the transport vessels. So now we're going to talk about the transport medium, which is blood. So blood transports nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, urea, which is the product of our kidneys, antibodies, hormones, heat, lots of things around the body. And it consists of two distinct elements. So there's blood plasma, which is the fluid portion of the blood, and then there are blood cells. There are white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes, red blood cells, which are also called erythrocytes, and platelets. Okay, so we're going to look more closely at the cells. So the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes, their function is to transport the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. That's what they do in the blood. Then we have the white blood cells, which are also called leukocytes, and they're part of the immune response, the immune system. And there are two different types. There are phagocytes And so, as part of the immune system, their job is to go around and find foreign particles and engulf them, take them into the cell. And then you have lymphocytes, which are also part of the immune system. They work with the phagocytes and they end up making antibodies. So something foreign gets in the body, the phagocytes eat it essentially, and then they display it to the lymphocytes, which recognize it and then make antibodies. And then finally, the platelets play a very important role in blood clotting. So we're not going to talk anymore about the white blood cells. That comes up in further studies in biology, but we're going to talk a little bit about the red blood cells and how they transport oxygen and carbon dioxide and how the platelets are involved in blood clotting. So oxygen transport in red blood cells. A mature red blood cell has no nucleus. Instead, it is packed with millions of molecules of hemoglobin, which is a protein that has an iron-containing molecule within it, and that molecule binds oxygen. So this is a drawing that represents hemoglobin. So it's got the sort of folded bits are the protein parts. So that's a folded polypeptide, the globin. So there's 4 of those. And then within there, there's a molecule called heme. And heme is the molecule that contains the iron. It looks like this. And so each of the globins has a heme molecule within it, and heme contains the iron. So there's the iron in the middle of the heme, and that's where oxygen can bind. So the heme forms a fairly loose bond with oxygen, which allows it to pick up and deliver oxygen in response to the requirements of the body. So in the capillaries of the lungs, where there's lots and lots of oxygen, the heme groups will bind to the oxygen. And then once the blood has reached the cells in other body tissues where the concentration of oxygen is relatively low because they're constantly using it up, the heme group will release the oxygen to provide it to those cells. And then in terms of platelets and blood clotting, so platelets are fragments of cells that contain no nucleus and break down really quickly. Clotting begins when clotting factors are released from damaged tissue cells or platelets. So you cut your skin, that has damaged cells. Platelets recognize this. Clotting factors are released. And these clotting factors set off a series of reactions in which the product of each reaction is the catalyst of the next reaction. So it's like a chain reaction and is often referred to as the blood clotting cascade. And so this system ensures that the clotting happens quickly when needed and that it only happens when it's needed. So you don't just clot randomly. So the clotting cascade is a fairly long cascade. We're just going to look at the final reactions. So you've got a series of reactions that are initiated by the clotting factors, and that leads to the activation of a protein called prothrombin activator. And what prothrombin activator does, and this is going to be shocking, it activates prothrombin. So prothrombin is inactive. And so prothrombin activator converts it into thrombin. So it chops off the pro, basically, and makes it an active protein, active enzyme called thrombin. So then what thrombin does is it takes a molecule of fibrinogen, which is soluble, which means fibrinogen just is in your blood. It's dissolved in your blood. It's always there. But when thrombin is present, it converts fibrinogen into fibrin, which is now insoluble. So the conversion of fibrinogen to fibrin involves the removal of sections of the polypeptide that have many negative charges. So when fibrinogen has all those negative charges, it is soluble in the blood. But once you remove those negative charges, it doesn't interact so well with the aqueous conditions in the blood, and it starts interacting with itself. So the removal of these charges allows fibrin to bind together to form a mesh across wounds. Once the mesh is there, blood cells start getting caught in that mesh, and they soon form a semi-solid clot. And if the clot is exposed to air, it's going to dry to form a protective scab, which remains until the wound is healed. So that's our look at the transport vessels and the transport medium in the circulatory system.